Hi. We've been discussing why the six tenets of the Constitution has made this a living document. Remember that the United States Constitution is the oldest democratic constitution in the history of the world. And it is because of popular sovereignty, federalism, limited government, separation of powers, checks and balances. But it's also because our founding fathers had the sense to understand that our Constitution needed to be able to change as society changed. Now, on your guided reading that you have in front of you, there are going to be some notes that you take that might or might not fit in the margins or above or below the notes that are on the front or on the back. It is entirely up to you where you want to take those notes. You can add them to a piece of paper and staple them, or you can take them in the bottom, or flip the paper on its side, however you would like to do that. When we're talking about amendments versus articles, we're talking about the additions or changes to the Constitution, and there are 27 of them. Originally, there were 7 articles. Yes, they both start with A. I'm sorry about that. But the amendments are the additions, those things that came later. When we are talking about formally amending the Constitution, we are talking about actually changing the words in the Constitution, adding them, but also deleting them. And all of them were done in Article 5. So if you look at your guided reading at the top, we're going to talk about first proposing the amendment and then ratifying the amendment. If you take a look at your chart and over to the left, you're going to see that proposing the amendments is done at the national level, and ratifying or approving it is done at the state level. It is about the most perfect example of federalism that there is. So at our national level, they get to suggest what we would add to the Constitution, but ultimately it is the state's responsibilities to approve it. So let's take a look at how you do this. 2/3 of both House of Representatives and the Senate need to propose the amendment. So let's say the amendment is a balanced budget amendment, saying that the United States government cannot take in more money, cannot spend more money than what it takes. 2/3 of both the House and the Senate have to do that in what is called a joint resolution. And I'm going to add that here, a joint resolution. Okay. A joint resolution, like when we studied parliamentary procedure, is the idea of I move and everybody jumps on. Notice that this is the only process that has been used. There are 2 processes mentioned in the Constitution, but this is the only one that has ever been used. 27 out of the 27 amendments have used it. Well, what's the other way? Well, it's a national convention that is called for by 2/3 of the states. And right now that magic number is 34. Every so often you hear of what are called the Liberty Amendments. There has been a strong movement, I would say, in the last 5 years to give this a shot. So why haven't we had a national convention called by 2/3 of the state? The primary reason is because we've never done it. People are worried that if we would suddenly have a national convention called by 34 of the states to meet, let's say in Kansas, to pass a balanced budget amendment, as the example before given, what if we all got there and we decided to go rogue and we added a bunch of other things to the agenda, and how would you choose how many representatives each state has? And would that be like in Congress where California would have more votes than Iowa? Because we've never done it is why we never do it. And I know that sounds really kind of like a silly reason, but the second alternative is present in the Constitution. But until we're more sure of how we would be able to handle it in the modern era, I don't see us adopting this. Okay? Ratifying the amendment, to ratify the amendment means to approve it. And we've used, out of the 27 amendments, 26 times we've done it the same way. We send it to the states, and their legislatures can approve it. It's simply a yay or nay vote. You have 7 years to do that. Okay? So 38 states, because 3/4 is different than 2/3, 38 states need to say yay or nay, and the amendment would pass. So what is the infamous 26th one, the one that we did not use? Well, it was for the 21st Amendment. We called a constitutional convention that met and they approved it. This convention was called for on the suggestion of Franklin Delano Roosevelt to eliminate the Prohibition Amendment. And that was because we were in the 1930s and it was depressing enough without having people having to stay sober. Okay. At the bottom of your worksheet, you'll see that there is a couple of paragraphs there that are going to ask you to fill them in. I'm going to fix this here just a minute. I thought I got them all. There we go. All right. In addition to the formal amendments of processing and ratifying the amendments, they also do it informally. More of our changes to our Constitution happen informally than they do formally. So if I were you, I would take and I would highlight this highlight this word, because this is the way that we change our Constitution. We've only changed it 27 times, yet there are so many changes to the way our government operates. Such changes occur through government leaders and citizens that fill in the details of the day-to-day basis. Congress have passed laws that have enlarged or clarified many of the Constitution's amendments. So what was not clear when our founding fathers created the Constitution, they did it through these laws. So for example, we knew that there was a president and we knew that there was a vice president, but until William Henry Harrison died, we never knew how presidential succession was going to take place. Also, the Supreme Court and its ability to interpret the Constitution has really changed the way the government has worked. Now, people from the very beginning of when the Supreme Court used this power thought that, have argued over how it should be. Should the courts just say yay or nay? When we were discussing in class earlier, when we were talking about Roe versus Wade, we know that the ability to just say, hey, that's unconstitutional, that is, I'm sorry, I clicked the wrong one at the time, a judicial restraint one. So this one right here. But when a court goes larger than what it says, it's judicially active. Okay? Well, we want to take those informal methods and give them, talk a little bit more in detail. And this is where I think you're going to need to take out a piece of paper. So at this time, take out a piece of paper and we're going to attach it to our note. Okay, so now that you have that piece of paper, we want to talk about informal amending. Informal amending means that you change the Constitution without changing the words. The advantages of informal amending is that it is faster, easier, and it's temporary. It is not a permanent part of our Constitution. It simply changes the intent. One of the first ways that we do that is through basic legislation. So, for example, laws that are passed by Congress. And I have here the Equal Rights Amendment, which was an amendment that was attempted to put in our Constitution, versus what is called Title IX. Okay? Another example would be that the Constitution sets up the Supreme Court and all lower courts. Okay, that's Article 3. Well, Congress didn't exactly know how to do that, so it passed the Federal Judiciary Act and it established our national court system. So today the way our court system is set up is because of that law, not because it's in the Constitution. That is an informal amendment. The ERA in Title IX, right here, what we're talking about, is on the back of your notes, and we're going to deal with that in class. All right, the second way that we deal with informal amending is congressional practices. For example, the power to impeach. Nowhere in the Constitution does it tell how we're supposed to do this. And the way that if a president or a Supreme Court is impeached, the House brings up the charges, that's the impeachment. The Senate acts as the court, declares you guilty or innocent, and the Chief Justice is the one that acts as the judge. We have used the power to impeach twice with Andrew Johnson and President Clinton. Another example would be, let me erase all this. is the idea of the Speaker of the House. The Speaker of the House, in the Constitution, it says we have to have a Speaker of the House, but nowhere does it say how we're supposed to choose one. The Speaker of the House could have been the mayor of Washington, D.C., or a cop or an ordinary citizen. But our founding fathers decided in the first couple of Congresses that they would choose it to be the majority, a member of the majority party, and they would elect a member from within themselves. And so that is how Paul Ryan got his job. Okay, the third way is what is called custom. Okay, tradition is a powerful way of amending the Constitution. For example, presidential succession. For years, all the way up until Kennedy, it was never in the Constitution that the vice president would take over if the president dies. And what would happen if the president and the vice president were both killed? Then the Speaker of the House would take over. They actually have a list that goes down all the way to 30 officials. That came with the 22nd Amendment. The 25th Amendment tells us that a president will only serve for 2 terms. We know that Franklin Delano Roosevelt served for 4 terms, and he broke with customs. In the 1960s, it was decided that 4 terms was a little long, and that really 8 years, like President Washington had, was more than enough. Okay. The next one, I don't remember what number we're on, is the idea of executive agreements. An executive agreement is an agreement between the president and another head of state. So, for example, President Trump and the president of Mexico, they could come to an agreement about the wall. And they both come to an agreement, and it's like a spit and a handshake. And in doing this, they bypass Congress. If we do a treaty, you understand, and we've talked about this, that if we would happen to do a treaty would need congressional approval. An executive agreement does not. Now, executive agreements have been done since President Washington. They are nothing new. But as time has gone on, and in the more modern era, they have become more and more powerful. And the last one, the one that we were talking about, is the idea of judicial review. Remember, judicial review is the ability for the courts to declare a law unconstitutional. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the courts have this. But in 1803, the courts decided to do that. And this has radically changed the powers of the government and the culture of the United States through their decision. Because a Supreme Court decision becomes law of the land. And the only way that you can overturn a Supreme Court decision is through a constitutional amendment. That's incredibly powerful. So, for example, nowhere in a judicial law, in a statute or basic legislation, does it outline when or how a woman can have an abortion. The Supreme Court decided that. Okay? As we said earlier, a judicial restraint is a court that says unconstitutional or constitutional and does not go any further than that. Whereas a judicially active court will say their decision, but then go further. That going further, that written document becomes law. And this is the way we changed civil rights, individual choice, and the judicially active courts of the 50s and 60s radically changed our Constitution. All right. So we are going to talk about these ways of informally and formally amending the Constitution when you come to class next. Everyone have a great day, and we'll see you later.